Wow, it's gone back down to like 14 degrees Celsius here in Shenzhen. Had to put the jacket on. And we're on a bit of a weather roller coaster here in Shenzhen. It was like 28 degrees Celsius like 2 days ago, and it's supposed to go back into the 20s tomorrow. But for today, might be a little bit of wind here. I apologize in advance for that. I do have the dead cat. Anyway, I have a video for you today, and this video is going to be a little different. I have a story I want to tell you. And as I read you the story, try to put yourself in the shoes of the characters in the story. But before I get started, I need to read the following disclaimer. Hold on. The story, all names, characters, and incidents portrayed in this production are fictitious. No identification with actual persons, living or deceased, places, buildings, and products is intended or should be inferred. No person or entity associated with this story received payment or anything of value, or entered into any agreement in connection with the depiction of tobacco products. Oddly enough, the title of the story is Trainwreck. Our story begins on the other side of the world in South Africa. There was a young man there. Let's call him Wilson. Wilson got himself into a little bit of trouble over there in South Africa. He ended up having to leave the country of his birth and find a new place to live. When Wilson was younger, Wilson enjoyed the hospitality and generosity of an Asian family. Plus, Wilson had a real affinity for anime girls. Wilson decided to sell most of his belongings, pack up the rest of them, and move to China. Stick with me, that's not the train wreck. Wilson started a YouTube channel while living in China and mostly made videos about motorcycles. Okay? At that time, there was not really any income from YouTube, so Wilson worked illegally as an English teacher. After a year or two and not much progress on Wilson's YouTube channel, Wilson decided to go all in on his YouTube efforts. Wilson started wearing a suit and switched to making videos about life in China. One day, while on a visa run to Hong Kong, Wilson met a nice Chinese girl. Let's call her Dear Girl. They dated a few more times, and then Dear Girl ended up coming back with Wilson to live in mainland China. As time went on, none other than the Chinese government featured Wilson on several television shows and countless newspaper articles. That's right, the CCP. Most often, the media exposure by the Chinese government included promotion of Wilson's YouTube channel, and things were starting to pick up. It must have been really confusing for Wilson, knowing that he was working illegally and yet working so closely with the Chinese government. But it was really helping his YouTube channel to grow. Things started to go pretty well for Wilson. He had a decent income from working illegally, a girl that allowed him to abuse her, and income from YouTube that was on the way up. Wilson's YouTube videos were becoming more and more just personal complaints about China, mostly just bitching. But Wilson started to notice his subscribers were reacting really well to that kind of material. Wilson ended up marrying Dear Girl, but due to the constant abuse, it was a short-lived marriage. That's still not the real train wreck. So now Wilson is on his own again, Dear Girl having left, back for Hong Kong. Wilson's videos often include heavy drinking and even drinking and driving. Because most of Wilson's subscribers are young males, most of them had no problem with Wilson's new lifestyle. Luckily for Wilson, it didn't take long before Wilson meets a new girl. Let's call her Natasha. Natasha was actually one of his students at the time. Seems a little weird. Anyway, she was an adult. Even though Natasha was from the mainland, Natasha had a good upbringing and proper education. Realizing Natasha was a real catch, Wilson didn't court her long before asking for her hand in marriage. Shortly after, they were married. Wilson's YouTube videos now were almost entirely negative towards everything in China. His camera started to seek out the worst of China. Anyone holding a rat, babies peeing on the street, and the worst toilets Wilson could find. Nearly all Wilson's subscribers were hungry for just that type of anti-China material. Now, even though Wilson had to lie to YouTube about his residence, because I mean, you can't monetize channels from mainland China, the money started to roll into his Hong Kong bank account. Wilson no longer needed to do government fluff pieces or work as an English teacher. Wilson's YouTube videos went from negative to nasty about China. Wilson's content was getting so nasty that Wilson started to get the attention of the Chinese people, who were obviously not happy that Wilson was focusing on only the negative aspects of China. But that was what Wilson's subscribers wanted. Realizing the growing hostility toward him, combined with the Chinese government deciding to strictly enforce visa laws, I mean, they were on the books all the time, but they just decided to enforce them, Wilson decided he needed to take Natasha and once again find a new place to live. Wilson moved to San Diego, USA. Wilson continued to have his YouTube revenue deposited to his Hong Kong bank, which was great because Wilson didn't need to pay any tax on that income. Although Wilson knew he obviously would not be able to do that forever. After great difficulty and a lot of legal fees, Wilson managed to get a business visa, which allowed Natasha to get a spousal visa. Not paying any income tax for nearly 14 years, it must have come as somewhat of a shock to Wilson when he finally had to start paying. Now Wilson was free to be as negative about China as he wanted, all while claiming to be some kind of human rights advocate for China. Although I don't know why, all of Wilson's subscribers know that's not what Wilson is about. After being in the US for a while, Wilson and Natasha have a baby. Being born in the US, their baby girl would automatically get US citizenship. That wouldn't actually change much for Wilson and Natasha, though. Wilson's child would need to reach 18 years of age before she could potentially sponsor Wilson and Natasha for US citizenship. Becoming somewhat paranoid due to the nature of his YouTube content, Wilson decided he needed to move to a more rural setting in a kind of secluded home. Natasha, being from a very populated area in mainland China, was now totally out of her comfort zone, no doubt becoming bored senseless. As Wilson grows even more paranoid, Wilson virtually bans Natasha from social media, isolating Natasha even further. Although that's bad enough, that's still not the train wreck. Just hang on. Blinded by the huge amount of money Wilson now makes, Wilson is now trapped into continuously searching for new ways to disparage Natasha's country of birth. As time passes, it becomes more and more frustrating to Wilson that he could no longer talk about personal experiences from China. Wilson now had to resort to scouring social media for topics to fill his audience's voracious appetite for anti-China content. Wilson begins to take that frustration out on Natasha. It doesn't take long until all the pressure on Natasha causes her to leave. This is when the real train wreck occurs, not for Wilson, but for Natasha. Natasha ends up being stuck with some pretty difficult decisions at this point. Although Natasha would get a healthy settlement in the divorce and a healthy amount of child support, Natasha's visa status would now come into question. Could Natasha go back to her homeland? Given her husband's constant disparaging of China, that would only complicate things for Natasha. Natasha never pictured herself getting into this kind of predicament. Can't stay here, can't go back there. What a mess, a literal train wreck. Not to mention that it would be very difficult for Natasha to enforce any legal decisions in her favor, like child support, if she were to go back to China. Remember, Wilson does not have the best morals and character. Staying in the US would now become very difficult for Natasha, and at the very least, Natasha would not be eligible for employment. Wilson, on the other hand, is now free to hook up with an American girl and get a green card. Wilson will also continue to become more wealthy from his YouTube channel bashing Natasha's homeland. At this point, I'd like to say, and Wilson lived happily ever after. But this story's not over yet. I'm sure there's going to be another chapter. Thanks for watching.